My daughter and her husband moved into my house after he lost his job, promising they only needed a few weeks to get back on their feet. Then my son-in-law's mother arrived with her bags and said my house is stuck in a paperwork dispute. I have nowhere else to go. I let them all in, never expecting them to push me out of the home I built for 32 years. They took my office, moved my wife's belongings, and sent me to the storage room. But what I discovered next changed everything. Thank you for being here truly. Take 1 second and tell me in the comments, what city or country are you watching from? Every comment helps this Dad Family Revenge channel reach someone who needs these stories. Please note some details in this story are fictional added for storytelling purposes. Names and locations are not intended to represent anyone specific, but the heart of this message is something I believe deeply. My name is Richard Hayes. I am 60 years old, and the house on Birchwood Avenue has been mine for 32 years. I want to get that on the record before I tell you anything else, because by the time this story ends, there will be people who dispute it. It was a January evening when everything began to unravel, though I did not know it yet. I was down in the basement workshop the way I spent most of my evenings since Margaret passed. The wood lathe was running shavings curling onto the concrete floor, and the single bulb above my workbench threw a circle of warm yellow light across the grain of a walnut board I had been shaping into a small side table. The smell of sawdust and linseed oil had soaked into the walls of that basement, the way good things do when they stay long enough. I breathed it in and felt the way I always felt down there, that the world was the right size. The house above me was a 4-bedroom colonial red brick white shutters, a covered porch that Margaret had lined with clay pots every spring from the first year we moved in until the last year she was well enough to carry them. I had poured the front walkway myself with a rented mixer and a bad back and more stubbornness than sense. I had reframed the kitchen doorway when the lintel sagged, retiled both upstairs bathrooms, run new electrical to the garage, and replaced every window on the north side the winter I turned 54 because the drafts were keeping Margaret awake. 35 years as a construction technician meant I never had to call a contractor. It also meant I was incapable of walking past something broken without stopping to fix it. 3 years ago, Margaret died. Ovarian cancer, 14 months from diagnosis to the morning. I sat beside her bed at Montefiore and watched her stop breathing. She was 57 years old. She had laugh lines around her eyes and a way of pronouncing my name, Richard, 2 quiet syllables that I have not heard from anyone since and do not expect to hear again. After she was gone, I kept the house the way she had kept it. Her photographs stayed on the shelf in the living room, 12 of them in mismatched frames she had collected from flea markets over the years. Her wedding watch, a thin gold-faced thing with a brown leather strap she had worn every day of our married life, sat on the dresser in the bedroom. I kept it in the nightstand drawer on Margaret's side of the bed in the same place she had always kept it. Some mornings I took it out and held it for a while before I put it back. It kept good time. That seemed important somehow. My life had settled into a shape I could live with. I had a pension from the union, a modest savings account, that Margaret and I had built carefully over 30 years, and no mortgage left on the house. Walter Brooks, who had lived next door for 25 years, and had the handshake of a man who had spent his career as an electrician, came over most Saturday mornings, and we drank coffee on the porch and argued about the Yankees the way men our age argue about things that don't matter. Because the things that matter are too heavy to pick up before noon. I was not lonely. I want to be clear about that. I was alone, which is a different thing entirely. I was on my second pass with the handplane when the phone on my workbench started vibrating against the wood. I reached over and turned it face up. Emily. My daughter called on birthdays, on Christmas, on the occasional Sunday when things were going well with her and Jason. She did not call on Tuesday evenings in January. My chest tightened the way it does when the father part of your brain fires before the rational part has the chance to weigh in. I set the plane down, wiped my hands on my work cloth, and picked up the phone. I said. Everything okay? Her voice came through already fraying at the edges, the particular unraveling sound that parents recognize the way they recognize a fever by touch. Something off, something wrong, something that needs fixing right now. Dad, she said. I didn't know who else to call. My hand gripped the phone a little tighter. 30 years of fixing broken things, and the sound of my daughter's voice coming apart at the seams still hit me somewhere below the sternum, a sharp, breathless ache that no amount of experience ever prepares you for. Talk to me, I said. I'm right here. She did not speak right away. I could hear her breathing on the other end of the line, the kind of breathing that comes after crying has stopped, but before a person has fully decided to trust their own voice again. I had heard that sound from Emily exactly twice before in her adult life. Once when she called to tell me Margaret's diagnosis. Once when she called to tell me the first pregnancy had not made it past 8 weeks. Take your time, I said, though every nerve in my body was doing the opposite of taking its time. It's Jason, she said finally. He lost his job, Dad, 3 weeks ago. He's been trying to find something, but nothing is coming through, and our lease is up at the end of the month, and the landlord won't renew because he wants to sell the unit, and we've looked at 6 other places. But everything requires 2 months of income verification, and Jason doesn't have that right now, and She stopped. I heard her pull in a shaky breath, the kind that sounds like it hurts going down. I don't know what else to do, she said. I wouldn't ask if there was anywhere else. I sat down on the stool beside my workbench and looked at the walnut board I had been planning. It had a good straight grain. I had been planning to finish it by February. How long? I said. What? How long would you need to stay? She made a sound that was halfway between a sob and a laugh, ragged at both edges. A few weeks, maybe. Just until Jason finds something. He's got interviews lined up, Dad. He really does. We just need somewhere to land while it comes together. I looked at the photograph on my workbench, the one I kept down there, because the basement was where I spent most of my time. It was Margaret and me on the front porch, the summer Emily turned 10, all 3 of us squinting into the sun. Margaret had her hand up, shading her eyes, and she was laughing at something off camera, and she looked so completely herself that some mornings I could not look at it directly. I thought about what Margaret would have said if she were sitting beside me right now. I did not have to think long. She would have said, "Richard, that is our daughter." And she would have been right. You can take the guest room, I said. Both of you. Come whenever you're ready. Emily let out a breath that seemed to have been stored up for 3 weeks. Thank you, Dad. I mean it. We'll stay out of your way, I promise. We'll help around the house. Jason is good with his hands, he can... I'm Emily, I said. It's fine, just come. They arrived on a Saturday, a week and a half later, in Jason's pickup truck, with 2 loads of boxes and a rolling suitcase each. I helped them carry things up from the driveway. Jason Miller was 37 years old, broad-shouldered, with an easy grin and the kind of firm handshake that men practice until it feels natural. He clapped me on the back when I opened the door and said, "Richard, I can't thank you enough. Seriously, we're going to make this as painless as possible. And don't mention it," I said. And I meant it. I genuinely meant it. The first week was better than I had expected. Emily made dinner on Wednesday, and the kitchen smelled like the rosemary chicken Margaret used to make on Sunday nights. And for a little while the house felt less like a museum of the life I used to have, and more like a place where people still lived. Jason shoveled the front walk without being asked on Thursday morning when 2 inches came down overnight, and I watched him from the kitchen window and thought, good. This is going to be fine. I should tell you something about myself before I go any further, because it matters for understanding everything that came after. I am not a man who asks for help. I am also not a man who says no when the people I love need it. Margaret used to say those two things together, in one person made for a certain kind of quiet trouble, and she was usually right about things like that. I told myself Emily and Jason needed a few weeks. I told myself it was temporary. I told myself that the house had 4 bedrooms, and 2 of them had been empty for 3 years, and there was no good reason a man needed that much space to himself. I was telling myself a lot of things that January. The trouble with telling yourself things is that you tend to believe them. On the 8th day, I came downstairs at 6 in the morning to make coffee, and found the kitchen had been reorganized. Not dramatically. Not all at once. Just enough that I opened 3 wrong cabinets before I found my own coffee mugs, and the percolator I had used every morning for 11 years had been moved to the counter beside the refrigerator to make room for a sleek stainless machine I did not recognize. I stood there in my wool socks on the tile floor and felt something shift in my chest. Not anger. Not yet. Something quieter than anger and harder to name. I made my coffee and took it to the porch and watched the sun come up over the rooftops on Birchwood Avenue and told myself it was just a coffee maker. That was the first thing I told myself that I knew, even as I was saying it was not entirely true. By the 3rd week of February, I had stopped expecting to find things where I left them. My toolbox moved from the mudroom to the garage without anyone asking. The reading lamp I kept beside the armchair in the living room got repositioned to the corner, because as Emily explained with a brightness in her voice that did not quite reach her eyes, the light was better for Jason when he was working on his laptop. The armchair itself got pushed 6 inches to the left to make room for a folding table Jason had brought up from their boxes, and the folding table acquired a monitor, a charging station, and a tangle of cables that spread across the corner of my living room like something that had taken root. I let each thing go individually. That is the only way I know how to explain it. Each one by itself was too small to fight over. Together they were building something I could not yet name. Walter came by on a Saturday morning, the way he always did, stomping snow off his boots on the porch before I even opened the door. He was a big man, Walter, with a white beard he had grown after retirement, and the particular stillness of someone who had spent decades working with live current and learned that panic was a luxury he could not afford. I handed him his coffee, and we sat at the kitchen table, and he looked around the room the way he always did when something was different, and said nothing about it for exactly as long as it took him to finish half his cup. "You rearrange in here," he said finally. "Emily did," I said. Walter nodded slowly. He took another sip. "She paying rent." I felt the back of my neck get warm. "She's my daughter, Walt." "I know who she is," he said. "I'm asking if she's paying rent." I did not answer, which was its own kind of answer. Walter looked at me over the rim of his mug with the expression of a man who has made his point and does not feel the need to repeat it. That afternoon, Jason found me in the garage and leaned against the door frame with his hands in his jacket pockets, his breath making small clouds in the cold air. He had that look he sometimes got, a kind of careful pleasantness, like a man choosing his words the way you choose your footing on ice. "Hey, Richard," he said. "Can I talk to you about something?" "It's about my mom." I set down the wrench I was holding. "What about her? So her name is Gloria. Gloria Miller. She's 65 and she lives over in the Bronx, has for about 20 years. He shifted his weight from one foot to the other. She's been having some trouble with her house. Paperwork dispute, something about the property title got tangled up in a county filing error, and now she's in this kind of legal limbo where she can't really stay there while it gets sorted out. I looked at him steadily. How long does something like that take to sort out? A few months, maybe, he said, and his voice stayed easy, stayed smooth the way water stays smooth, right before it goes over a falls. She's 65, Richard. She can't exactly go stay in some extended stay motel by herself. And we can't just leave her hanging. You know how it is. I did know how it was. That was the problem. I thought about saying no. I want to be honest with you about that. Some part of me, the part that had been watching my coffee mugs migrate to the wrong cabinet for 3 weeks, said, Richard, do not open that door. But then I looked at Jason's face and thought about a 65-year-old woman, alone in a county filing dispute, and the part of me that Margaret had spent 30 years encouraging won out over the part of me that had learned anything from experience. Oh, she can take the back bedroom, I said. The one with the window facing the yard. Jason's face broke into a wide, relieved grin, and he reached out and gripped my shoulder. Richard, I mean it, you're a good man. She'll be so grateful. We all are. I nodded and picked up my wrench and waited until I heard his footsteps cross back toward the house, before I let out a long, slow breath that fogged in the cold garage air and disappeared. I stood there for a moment, with my hand on the workbench, feeling something I could not quite identify pressing against the inside of my chest. Not dread exactly. Not yet. More like the feeling you get when you are on a roof and you take one step and the shingle moves just slightly under your boot, not enough to fall, but enough to know that the surface you are standing on is not as solid as it looked from the ground. I had said yes. I had said it because Gloria Miller was 65 years old and alone and needed somewhere to land, and because I was the kind of man who opened doors when people needed them opened. What I did not know yet was that some doors, once you open them, do not close from the inside. Gloria Miller arrived on a Thursday afternoon in late February with 2 SUV loads of belongings and the energy of a woman who had decided before she ever set foot in my house exactly how she felt about it. I watched from the porch as Jason and Emily unloaded the first vehicle. Boxes, yes, I expected boxes. But there were also framed pictures wrapped in moving blankets, a floor lamp with a fringed shade, 3 large decorative vases that I could see no practical use for a set of matching kitchen canisters, and a rolled-up area rug banded with plastic wrap. These were not the possessions of a woman preparing for a temporary inconvenience. These were the possessions of a woman who had thought carefully about where things would go. Gloria herself stepped out of the passenger side and stood in my driveway and looked up at the front of the house with her hand shading her eyes against the pale winter sun. She was a solid woman, thick through the shoulders with silver hair cut close to her head, and the kind of posture that suggested she had spent a lifetime walking into rooms and expecting them to rearrange themselves around her. Bigger than I pictured, she said. Not to me specifically, to the air in front of her. I came down the porch steps and put out my hand. Gloria, Richard Hayes, welcome. She shook it with a firm, dry grip and looked at me with pale gray eyes that moved over my face the way an appraiser's eyes move over a property, taking stock, calculating. Jason talks about you, she said. Good things, I hope, I said. She smiled, but the smile did not climb as far as those gray eyes. He says you're a generous man. Something about the way she said it, generous, made the word feel less like a compliment and more like a category she had placed me in. One she had found useful before. By evening, the back bedroom had been transformed. The reading chair I kept in there. Margaret's reading chair, the green upholstered one she had reupholstered herself the summer of 2009, was sitting in the hallway outside the door. When I saw it there, my heart lurched sideways in my chest, a sudden painful knock against my ribs that I was not prepared for. Gloria needed the space for her dresser, Emily said from behind me. Her voice had that careful quality. It sometimes got measured and slightly too bright, like she was already preparing to talk me down from something. "That's Margaret's chair," I said. "I know, Dad." She touched my arm briefly. "It's just temporary. We can put it in the living room for now." I looked at the chair sitting in the hallway, the green fabric a little worn at the armrests from the years Margaret had spent reading in it every night before bed. My throat tightened to the point where swallowing took effort. I wanted to say that it was not just a chair, that Margaret had picked out the fabric herself from a bolt at a shop on McLean Avenue and spent 3 weekends redoing the upholstery because she said the original color made the room look tired. That I had watched her work on it from the doorway and brought her cups of tea, and that some evenings I still sat in it just to have something of hers to hold on to. I did not say any of that. "Fine," I said, and the word came out flatter than I intended. That night at dinner, Gloria sat at the head of my kitchen table, my chair, the one I had occupied for 32 years, and talked about the house as if she were already familiar with its flaws. "The water pressure in the back bathroom was low," she said. "The overhead light in the kitchen was harsh. Someone should get a warmer bulb. The living room would benefit from different curtains. The current ones let in too much morning light." Jason nodded along to each observation with the easy agreement of a man who had been listening to this particular voice his entire life. Emily looked at her plate and moved her food around, and said nothing, though twice I saw her jaw tighten in a way she probably did not realize was visible from where I was sitting. "The curtains were Margaret's," I said, when Gloria got to the living room. Gloria reached for the salt shaker with the unhurried confidence of a woman who had not heard anything that required her to change course. "Well," she said pleasantly, "Margaret isn't here anymore, is she?" The words landed in the middle of the dinner table like something dropped from a height. Jason cleared his throat. Emily's fork stopped moving. My hand tightened around my glass until I could feel my pulse in my fingertips. The heat behind my eyes came fast and sharp, the kind that precedes tears in men who rarely allow themselves that particular release. I breathed in through my nose once slowly, the way you do when you are at the top of a ladder and the wind picks up. "No," I said, keeping my voice level with everything I had. "She isn't." I finished dinner. I washed my own plate. I went down to the basement workshop and stood at my workbench for a long time, without picking anything up, just resting both palms flat on the wood surface and staring at the grain, feeling the rough texture under my hands, while something large and hot and wordless moved through my chest, looking for a way out. Above me I could hear Gloria's voice carrying through the kitchen floor, still talking, still cataloging, still finding things that needed to be different. I noticed the photographs were gone on a Monday morning. Not all at once, that would have been too obvious, even for Gloria. It happened the way everything's happened in those weeks, incrementally, one thing at a time, each small enough to question whether you were overreacting. The 2 wedding photos that had sat on the left side of the living room shelf were gone first. Then the one of Margaret and Emily at Emily's nursing school graduation. Then the family photograph from the Christmas we spent in Vermont. All 3 of us in front of a fireplace that Margaret had insisted on finding specifically because she wanted a photograph in front of a real fireplace and not a fake one. By the time I noticed the shelf was nearly bare, Gloria had arranged 3 decorative ceramic pieces in the spaces where my wife's face used to be. I found Emily in the kitchen pouring coffee, still in her scrubs from the night shift. Her eyes had the particular hollowness of someone who had been awake too long, and she wrapped both hands around her mug the way you hold something warm when the rest of the world has gone cold. The photographs are gone, I said. She looked up at me, and something moved behind her eyes, a flicker of discomfort she was already working to smooth over before it reached her expression. Gloria needed the shelf space, Dad. I put them somewhere safe. Where? The hall closet, in a box. They're not damaged, I made sure of that. My chest tightened so sharply it took my breath for a moment. I thought about those photographs sitting in a cardboard box in the dark of a closet, faces pressed against cardboard, and felt a grief that surprised me with its force. I had thought I was past the sharpest edges of missing Margaret. I was wrong. Grief does not diminish so much as it goes quiet, and certain things can bring it roaring back in an instant. I'd like them back on the shelf, I said. My voice came out steady. I was proud of that. Emily set her mug down and pressed her lips together. Dad, she just needs a little space to feel comfortable. It's temporary. Can you let this one go? For me. I looked at my daughter's face, at the exhaustion in it, at the plea underneath the exhaustion, and I let it go. Because she was my daughter, and she was tired, and I did not want to add to what she was already carrying. I went upstairs, found the box in the closet, and carried it to the bedroom. I set it on the dresser and opened the nightstand drawer Margaret's side where her wedding watch sat, the way it always had gold-faced brown leather strap worn smooth at the clasp. I looked at it for a moment, then opened the box and looked at the photographs for a long moment, my throat working against something I refused to let become tears in the middle of a Tuesday. Then I opened the nightstand drawer, the bottom one, the one I had not opened since the week after Margaret's funeral. Her letters were still there, 12 of them written on the pale blue stationery she had always preferred, in the careful handwriting that had gotten shakier toward the end. She had written them during her last 2 weeks at Montefiore, one for each of the people she loved most, and she had asked the nurse to give them to me after. I had read mine once the night I got home from the hospital and had not been able to read it again. But I knew it was there. Knowing it was there mattered. I closed the drawer carefully and went back downstairs. That afternoon, Jason caught me in the hallway outside my own office door and leaned against the frame with his arms crossed and his head tilted in the way he had when he was about to say something he had already decided he was going to say, regardless of how it landed. Hey, so I wanted to run something by you, he said. About this room. I looked at him. What about it? You're retired, right? You don't really need a dedicated office space anymore. He said it with a smile, easy and reasonable, the way you say something you have been practicing. Mom could really use a proper room. The back bedroom is fine, but it's small, and this space is just sitting here most of the day. The heat came up the back of my neck so fast it made my ears ring. This room was where I had designed the kitchen remodel in 2011. Where I had sat with Margaret when we planned Emily's college finances, spreading papers across the desk, while she made notes in the margin. Where I had spent the first 6 months after Margaret died, just sitting in the chair by the window, because sometimes a person needs a room with a door they can close. I'll think about it, I said. It was the first lie I told in my own house. It would not be the last. I did not have to think about it long. 3 days after Jason brought up the office, I came home from a hardware run on Central Avenue to find the door standing open, and Gloria inside measuring the wall above the radiator with a fabric tape measure she had produced from somewhere, muttering numbers under her breath, with the focused efficiency of a woman who had already made every decision and was simply confirming dimensions. My drafting table had been pushed against the far wall. The 2 bookshelves I had built myself from red oak were still standing, but the books had been stacked on the floor in uneven piles to make room for a row of Gloria's decorative boxes along the upper shelves. My filing cabinet, the one that held 30 years of project records, and the folder of Margaret's medical paperwork I had never been able to throw away, was sitting in the hallway. "What's happening in here?" I said. Gloria looked up from her measuring without any particular urgency. Jason said you were fine with this room. My jaw tightened so hard I felt it in my back teeth. Jason said I was thinking about it. Well? She wrote a number on the notepad in her hand. It's a better space for my things. You're retired, Richard. You don't need all this room just to putter around. Putter around. 35 years of construction work, and she used the words putter around. Emily appeared in the doorway behind me, still in her coat from work. Her face doing the careful balancing act it had been doing for weeks, trying to look like everything was reasonable when everything was not. Dad, we talked about this. We did not talk about this, I said. Jason mentioned it. I said I needed to think. It's just a room, Dad. I looked at my daughter and felt something crack open in my chest. Not anger, but a sorrow that was almost worse than anger, because it had no clean direction to move in. It's not just a room, I said. It's my house. Emily flinched. Just slightly. Just enough. Then she straightened and said quietly, "We can set you up a workspace in the storage room out back. It's actually a decent size once you clear it out. The storage room. The place where I kept lawn equipment and holiday bins and the boxes of Margaret's clothes I had not been able to donate. She was suggesting I work in there. I was 60 years old and had built half the structures I had ever worked in with my own 2 hands, and my daughter was suggesting I work in the storage room. I said nothing more. I picked up my filing cabinet one end at a time and moved it to the storage room myself, because I was not going to give anyone the satisfaction of watching me ask for help with it. That evening, I called Walter from the storage room with the door closed. She measured the walls, Walt, I said. While my books were still on the shelves, Walter made a sound on the other end of the phone that was not quite a word. Then he said, "Richard, how many people are living in your house right now?" 3. "And how many of them are on the deed?" 1. A pause. "You want to come over for coffee tomorrow morning?" "Yeah," I said. "I think I do." I went to bed that night in the storage room on a cot I had set up against the wall of lawn equipment, listening to the house settle around me the way old houses do in winter, the particular creaks and contractions of wood and plaster that I knew as well as I knew my own breathing after 32 years. I had learned every sound this house made. I knew which stair clicked, which window rattled in a north wind, which radiator knocked twice before it heated up. This was my house. I had built parts of it with my own hands. I had brought Margaret home to it, raised Emily in it, buried my grief inside it when Margaret left. And now I was lying on a cot in the storage room listening to Gloria Miller's television murmuring through 2 walls and a ceiling. I stared at the water stain on the storage room ceiling that I had been meaning to patch for 2 years and thought about what Walter had said. How many of them are on the deed? Just the 1. Just me. I was still thinking about it when I finally fell asleep. It was the following evening, a Thursday, that I heard what I was not supposed to hear. I had come back from Walter's earlier than expected and was moving quietly through the kitchen to get a glass of water when I caught the sound of voices from the other side of the partially closed kitchen door. Jason's voice, then Gloria's, low and easy, the way people talk when they believe no one is within earshot. I stopped moving. Jason said, "It's going well. Better than I expected, honestly." Gloria said something I did not catch, and then Jason's voice came back clearer. "Once he gets used to being out back, he'll start feeling like a visitor in his own house. That's when it gets easier." My hand, which had been reaching for the cabinet handle, dropped to my side. Gloria laughed, a short, satisfied sound. "Men like Richard, you make them feel guilty enough, and they hand you everything without you having to ask twice." Then Emily's voice, quieter than the others, said, "I just want him to understand that this house makes more sense for a family. He rattles around in here alone. I stood on the cold kitchen floor with my heart hammering so loudly, I was certain they would hear it through the door. Every muscle in my body had gone rigid. My hands curled into fists at my sides, not from rage but from the physical effort of staying absolutely still while the world I thought I understood rearranged itself into something I did not recognize. I did not push the door open. I did not say a word. I turned around, walked back through the hallway, out the front door, and sat down on the porch steps in the February cold without my coat on. The night air hit my face like a slap, and I welcomed it. I sat there until my fingers went numb, and the feeling in my chest sorted itself from shock into something colder and clearer and considerably more dangerous. This was not a misunderstanding. This was not family stumbling over each other in a tight space. This was a plan, and I was the last one to know about it. Before I tell you what Walter found outside my house that morning, and I promise you it will change everything you thought you understood about this situation, I need to know if you are still with me. Drop the number 7 in the comments right now. Just the number 7. That is all I ask. Your support means the world to this Revenge Dad community, and it helps more people find stories like this one. Quick note: portions of this story contain fictional elements created for reflection and entertainment. If that is not something you wish to continue with, you are welcome to step away, no hard feelings at all. I called Walter at 7 the next morning, standing in the storage room with my boots still unlaced and a cup of coffee going cold in my hand. "I need to talk," I said. "Not on the phone." He was at my back gate in 4 minutes. We sat at the picnic table in the yard because I did not want to have this conversation inside the house. The February air was sharp and still, and Walter wrapped both hands around his travel mug and listened without interrupting, while I told him everything I had heard through the kitchen door the night before. When I finished, he did not offer sympathy or tell me I must have misunderstood. He just looked at the back of the house for a moment, at the kitchen window where the light was already on, and said, "How long have they been here?" 7 weeks, I said. He nodded slowly. "Richard, there's a difference between helping family and letting them take your life out from under you." He said it quietly, without drama, the way Walter said most things. "You know that, right?" My throat tightened. "I'm starting to." "Good." He took a long sip of coffee. "Because I need to tell you something I saw last week that I didn't think much of at the time." He had been trimming the hedge along the front of his property on a Wednesday afternoon when he noticed a man standing outside my front fence. Not a neighbor. Not a delivery driver. A man in a gray wool coat with a laser measuring device, the kind Walter recognized immediately from decades of electrical work, where precise dimensions mattered, pointed at the front face of my house. The man had photographed the facade from 3 angles, written in a small notebook, and driven away in a white sedan. Walter had noted the license plate out of habit. My coffee cup stopped halfway to my mouth. He was measuring my house. Front width setback from the street, looks like he got the roofline too. Walter pulled a folded receipt from his jacket pocket and slid it across the picnic table. The plate number was written on the back in his careful block print. I should have mentioned it sooner. Didn't connect it until now. I stared at those numbers and letters and felt something cold settle in my stomach that had nothing to do with the February air. That afternoon, I went to see Claire Morgan. Claire managed the Birchwood Avenue Community Association and had worked for 15 years at the Westchester County Clerk's office before taking the neighborhood role. She was a precise, unhurried woman who kept her files in perfect order and had the particular confidence of someone who had spent a decade and a half reading property records and knew exactly what they meant. I had spoken to her maybe a dozen times over the years at street meetings, and once when a drainage issue on the north end of the block needed sorting out. I showed her Walter's plate number and told her what he had seen. She looked at the plate number for a moment, and then she said she knew someone who could help a retired Westchester sheriff's deputy who now worked as a licensed private investigator and occasionally helped the community association on background checks for commercial vendors. She made one call. He called her back in 2 hours. That plate belongs to a vehicle registered to Harmon Property Valuation Services, she said. They're a licensed appraisal firm out of White Plains. They do residential valuations, estate assessments, pre-sale appraisals. She paused. Richard, someone hired them to appraise your house. The word appraise landed in my chest like a dropped weight. Can you find out who hired them? I asked. Not directly, she said. But I can tell you that nobody contacts an appraisal firm for a property they're renting. You hire appraisers when you're planning to buy, sell, or transfer ownership. Another pause, shorter this time. Whoever hired them is thinking about what your house is worth, and it wasn't you. I thanked her and hung up and sat in my truck in the parking area behind the community building for a long time, watching the light fade over the rooftops to the west. The cold crept in through the window seals, and I did not start the engine. 7 weeks ago, I had opened my door because my daughter called me crying. Now a man in a gray coat was measuring my house from the sidewalk, and someone was paying him to do it. I drove home. I parked in the driveway. I sat there a moment longer, looking at the lit windows of the house I had built my life inside, and felt the ground under everything I thought I knew begin very quietly to shift. Claire called at 7:45 the next morning, while I was sitting on the cot in the storage room with my boots on and nowhere particular to go. I picked up on the first ring. Richard, she said, I need you to come in. Not a phone conversation. I was at her office in the community building on Birchwood within 20 minutes. It was a small room, neat the way Claire herself was neat, with 2 filing cabinets and a desk that held nothing unnecessary. She had a folder open in front of her when I sat down, and she turned it to face me without preamble. I pulled the permit records for your address from the city's building permit database, she said. Standard search public record. Anyone can access it. She tapped the top sheet. There's an application for a renovation permit filed 6 days ago for the property at your address on Birchwood Avenue. I looked at the document. The address was mine. The description of work was mine: kitchen renovation, bathroom update, structural assessment of the rear addition. The name listed as owner of record was Jason Miller. The air went out of my lungs so completely and so suddenly that for a moment I could not draw it back in. I sat there staring at my own address with another man's name attached to it, and felt something move through me that was not quite anger and not quite fear, but contained elements of both, something hot and disorienting that started in my chest and moved outward to my hands until I could feel them trembling against my thighs. He filed this, I said. The words came out flat. He listed himself as the owner. He did, Claire said. She kept her voice even, professional, but her eyes were doing something different. Richard, filing a false instrument with a government agency in New York State is a criminal offense. Under Penal Law Section 175.35, knowingly filing a document you know to be false, in this case, falsely claiming ownership of a property, is a Class E felony. She paused. And because someone had to sign as the property owner on the application, and that signature is not yours, there's a secondary issue. Falsifying a signature on a legal document falls under Penal Law Section 170.10. Forgery in the second degree. That's a Class D felony, which carries more weight. I heard the words. I understood them individually. It took me a moment to assemble them into what they actually meant. He signed my name, I said. The signature on the application is not consistent with the signature on your deed, Claire said carefully. I pulled your deed from the county records for comparison. I'm not a handwriting expert, but I've been reading property documents for 15 years, and I can tell you they don't match. I pressed both palms flat on the surface of her desk, not to steady myself, but because I needed to feel something solid under my hands while the room recalibrated around me. My jaw was tight enough to ache. Behind my eyes there was a pressure building that I recognized as the kind that precedes the sort of reaction I was not going to have in Claire Morgan's office on a Tuesday morning. "What does the permit do for him?" I asked. "If it goes through." "It creates a government record linking Jason Miller to your property as its owner," Claire said. "It's not a deed transfer, it doesn't give him legal title, but it establishes a paper trail. If he later tried to dispute ownership, tried to claim some kind of equitable interest in the property, having his name on a city permit as owner of record gives him something to point to. It muddies the water." I sat back in the chair. I thought about Jason's easy grin when he shook my hand at my own front door 7 weeks ago. I thought about the word generous and the way Gloria had said it the first day she arrived. "Has the permit been approved?" I said. "Not yet. It's in review." She closed the folder. "Richard, I want you to call an attorney before you do anything else. Not tomorrow. Today." I drove home on autopilot, barely aware of the route I had driven 10,000 times. I pulled into the driveway and sat with the engine running. Looking at the front of my house, the brickwork I had repointed myself the summer of 2007, the porch railing I had rebuilt after a bad winter, the front walk I had poured with my own hands. When I went inside, Emily was in the kitchen making lunch, and she turned and smiled at me with a warmth that hit me somewhere painful, because I did not know anymore how much of it was real. "Hey, Dad," she said. "Hungry?" "No," I said. "Thanks, Em." I went downstairs to the workshop and sat at my bench and stared at the walnut board I still had not finished. My hands would not stop shaking for a good 10 minutes. Not from fear. From the particular fury of a man who has been patient for a very long time and is beginning to understand that his patience has been mistaken for permission. Claire called again 2 days later on a Thursday afternoon while I was in the storage room pretending to organize boxes that did not need organizing. I had gotten good at pretending in those weeks. Pretending I did not hear things through walls. Pretending the filing cabinet in the hallway did not bother me. Pretending at dinner that I was a man eating a meal in his own home rather than a guest who happened to know where the silverware was kept. I picked up the phone and Claire said without greeting, "I found something else." Something in her voice made me sit down on the nearest box. "Tell me." "I pulled the property records for Gloria Miller at her address in the Bronx," she said. "The one Jason described as being tied up in a title dispute, temporarily unavailable while the county sorted out a filing error." A pause, deliberate and weighted. "Richard, that property sold 8 months ago. Clean sale, no encumbrances, no disputes of any kind. The deed transferred to new owners in June. Gloria Miller has not had any legal connection to that property since the day it closed." I sat very still on that box, with the phone pressed against my ear and the storage room walls close around me. "There was no title dispute," I said. "There was no title dispute," Claire confirmed. "There was no filing error. There was no paperwork limbo. The house sold, the proceeds went to the seller, and that was the end of it." Her voice was careful, and even the voice of a woman delivering information she wishes she did not have. "Gloria Miller has not had a home to return to since last June. She knew that when she moved into yours. The full weight of it took a moment to settle. Not the anger arrived quickly, a hot, bright flash behind my sternum. What took longer Was the understanding underneath the anger the thing that hurt more than being deceived? Emily did not know. My daughter had called me in tears, genuinely distressed, genuinely frightened, asking for help because her mother-in-law had nowhere to go. And the part about nowhere to go was true, just not for the reason anyone had told Emily. Gloria had sold her house 8 months before any of this started, had known all along she had no place to return to, and had let my daughter believe a lie that sent Emily to me with tears in her voice on a January night. My throat tightened until swallowing took real effort. I thought about Emily on the phone that night, how her voice had frayed at the edges, how she had said I didn't know who else to call. She had not known she was delivering a script someone else had written. Walt, I said, though Claire was still on the line. Sorry, Claire said. Nothing, I said. Claire, thank you. I mean that. Call that attorney, she said. Today, Richard, not tomorrow. I hung up and sat there for a long moment with the phone in both hands, turning it over the way you turn a thing over when you need your hands to be doing something while your mind catches up to what it has just learned. Above me through the ceiling, I could hear the television in the living room, some afternoon program with a laugh track that fired on cue every 30 seconds. I went out through the back gate and knocked on Walter's door. He took one look at my face and stepped aside to let me in without asking any questions, which was one of the things I had always valued most about Walter Brooks. He put coffee on set, 2 mugs on the kitchen table, and sat down across from me with the patient stillness of a man who has learned that some conversations need to find their own pace. I told him what Claire had found. Walter listened with both hands around his mug, his eyes on me, his expression moving through several things, without settling on any of them. When I finished, he exhaled slowly through his nose. So the whole story about the title dispute never happened, I said. She sold the house in June, 8 months before she walked through my front door. Walter set his mug down with a careful deliberateness that I recognized as the thing he did when he was angry and choosing not to show it. And Emily doesn't know, I said. I'm sure of it. He nodded slowly. That makes it worse, doesn't it? Yeah, I said. It does. We sat there with our coffee going cool between our hands while the afternoon light shifted across Walter's kitchen floor. Outside, a car moved slowly down Birchwood Avenue, tires crunching over the last gray remnants of February's snow. Somewhere in my house, the laugh track fired again. What are you going to do? Walter said. I looked at my hands on the table. I thought about Margaret's watch sitting in the nightstand drawer upstairs, the gold-faced one with the brown leather strap, the way it had sat there every morning since the funeral, waiting the way things wait when there is no one left to use them. I'm going to find out how deep this goes, I said. And then I'm going to call that attorney. Walter picked up his mug. Good, he said. And Richard? Yeah. Now don't tell them you know. Not yet. He looked at me steadily over the rim. Let them think it's still working. I drove home and parked in the driveway and sat looking at the front of the house in the thin, late February light. My nephew Thomas was coming down from White Plains that weekend to help me with a few things around the house. It had been a standing arrangement for months, something we did when we could manage it, the two of us in the workshop on a Saturday afternoon. I had not thought much about it until right now. But something told me this particular Saturday was going to matter in ways I could not yet account for. Thomas Hayes was 28 years old and had his father's eyes, my brother Gerald's eyes, dark and steady, the kind that took in a room quickly and did not miss much. Gerald had been gone 11 years now, a heart attack at 51 that none of us saw coming, and Thomas was the closest thing to him that remained in the world. He drove down from White Plains every few weeks when he could manage it, And on those Saturdays we worked in the basement workshop together, the way Gerald and I used to, not talking much, just building things side by side in the particular companionship that does not require words to be real. He arrived at 10 in the morning with a bag of groceries and the easy confidence of a young man who knew he was welcome. He stopped in the kitchen doorway, took one look at the state of things, the unfamiliar coffee machine, the reorganized cabinets, the general sense of a space that no longer quite belonged to the person who owned it, and said without commentary, "Workshop." "Workshop," I said. We spent the morning downstairs. I told him most of it while we worked, keeping my voice low, and even the way you talk when you are telling someone something that still does not feel entirely real even as you say it out loud. Thomas listened the way Gerald used to listen, without interrupting, turning a piece of scrap wood over in his hands, while I talked, his jaw getting tighter by degrees, until by the time I finished, he was gripping that piece of wood hard enough that his knuckles had gone pale. "Uncle Richard," he said, "that's not a family going through a rough patch. That's a scheme." "I know," I said. "What do you need me to do?" "Right now, nothing. Just be here." He nodded and went back to sanding, but I could see the tension in his shoulders that did not leave for the rest of the morning. After lunch, Thomas offered to look at my phone, a 3-year-old model that had been running slow for months. We were sitting at the kitchen table, the house quiet, because Gloria had gone out, and Emily was sleeping after a night shift, and Jason was somewhere upstairs. Thomas was walking me through clearing the cache on my device when his hand stopped moving. He was not looking at my phone. Jason's phone was on the table face down, charging from the outlet beside the microwave. While we had been sitting there, it had buzzed once and gone still. Now it buzzed again, and this time the screen lit up and stayed lit, a preview notification from a contact saved as Mom, visible even from across the table. The preview read, "How much longer he signed anything yet?" Thomas and I both saw it at the same moment. Neither of us moved for the space of 2 full seconds. Then Thomas looked at me, and I looked at the phone, and I said, "Is it unlocked?" The name, the words, the question, all of it visible in the notification without unlocking anything. Thomas angled the phone slightly so I could read the full preview text, and we stood there in the quiet kitchen reading the same words at the same time. Thomas read it first, his eyes moving quickly down the screen. I watched his face change. The color left it in a slow, terrible way, the way color leaves a face when the body redirects everything it has toward processing something the mind does not want to accept. He turned the phone so I could read it. That evening, while Jason was upstairs and the kitchen was empty, Thomas sat back down at my laptop and opened a folder I had never seen before, the temporary print spooler cache, where Windows stores recent print jobs before clearing them. Jason had used my computer to print documents at least twice. Thomas pulled up what was still recoverable in the cache. It was enough to show a pattern, and while he worked, he talked me through what that single notification preview already meant. The name. The question. How much longer he signed anything yet, 7 words that contained an entire plan. Thomas looked at me across the workbench and said, "Uncle Richard, someone has been waiting on a schedule, and you're the last item on it. POA, power of attorney. A durable power of attorney for property management would allow the person named as agent to conduct transactions on behalf of the property owner. Sign contracts, authorize sales, act in the eyes of the law as if they were the owner themselves." Jason was planning to have me sign over legal authority to act on my own property, and he was going to present it to me as something routine, something harmless, a form for insurance purposes or estate planning or some other reasonable-sounding thing that a 60-year-old widower might not read carefully enough. What Jason did not know, what I knew from a conversation I had quietly with Claire 3 days earlier, was that a durable power of attorney in New York State required notarization. It required 2 witnesses. A signature alone, even a genuine one, was not sufficient. But he was working toward it. That much was clear. Thomas set the phone back down, face down exactly as it had been. His hands were not entirely steady. "Uncle Richard," he said, and his voice came out rough at the edges, scraped over something painful. "Did you know about any of this?" "Some of it," I said. "Not all of it." He pressed both hands flat on the table and stared at them. His eyes were bright in a way that had nothing to do with happiness, the particular brightness that comes when a person is holding something in that wants very badly to come out. "Aunt Emily," he said. "Does she know?" "No," I said. "I don't think she does." Thomas looked up at me then, and I saw in his face the same thing I had felt sitting on the porch steps in the February cold, the night I heard Jason's voice through the kitchen door. The ground shifting, the world rearranging into a shape that was harder and less forgiving than the one you thought you were standing in. "What do we do?" he said. I reached over and put my hand briefly on his shoulder, the way Gerald used to do when things were bad and there was nothing useful to say. "Should we do this carefully?" I said. "And we do it right." Thomas left Sunday afternoon, and I stood at the front door and watched his car disappear around the bend in Birchwood Avenue, and felt the particular loneliness that comes not from being alone, but from watching the one person who fully understood what you were carrying drive away into the ordinary world. I did not sleep well that night. I lay on the cot in the storage room with the ceiling close above me, and the sounds of the house moving through the walls, Gloria's television, the pipes in the upstairs bathroom, the radiator that knocked twice before it heated up, sounds I had lived with for 32 years, and that now felt like they belonged to a place I was only visiting. In the morning, I made coffee before anyone else was up and stood at the kitchen window, watching the light come in gray and thin over the backyard. The way March light comes in New York, when it has not yet decided to be spring. I drank my coffee, and I thought about the message thread on Jason's phone and the words, "He's softer than I expected," and I felt something harden in my chest that I did not try to soften back down. Then I went upstairs. I had not been in the master bedroom since the week Gloria had moved her measuring tape along the walls. The door was closed, and I knocked once out of a habit so old it was practically reflexive, 32 years, of knocking on my own bedroom door when Margaret was sleeping, because she was a light sleeper, and I kept early hours. The knock felt wrong the moment I did it. It was my door. It had always been my door. No one answered. Gloria was in the kitchen. I had heard her moving around when I came through. I pushed the door open. The room had been reorganized with a thoroughness that stopped me in the doorway. Margaret's reading lamp was gone. The small watercolor above the dresser, a painting of the Hudson River, that Margaret had bought at a street fair in Tarrytown the summer Emily turned 7, was gone, replaced by one of Gloria's large framed prints, a garish thing in oranges and reds that belonged in a hotel lobby. The dresser itself had been cleared of everything that had been on it and restocked with Gloria's things, her bottles, her boxes, her small framed photograph of Jason at what looked like a graduation. I breathed in through my nose and moved to the nightstand on the left side of the bed. Margaret's side. I had not moved anything from this nightstand in 3 years. I opened the top drawer. Her reading glasses were still there, folded lenses I had never cleaned, because cleaning them felt like erasing something. But the watch was gone. The gold-faced watch with the brown leather strap, the scratch at the 2 o'clock position she had always said was part of the story, gone. I stood there with my hand still on the handle, and then opened the bottom drawer. It had been emptied with some care, nothing left behind, not even the small rubber band that Margaret had kept in the corner of it for no reason either of us could remember. The letters were gone. 12 letters on pale blue stationery in Margaret's handwriting. The handwriting that it had gotten shakier toward the end, written during her last 2 weeks at Montefiore, when she still had enough strength to hold a pen. One for each of the people she loved most. Mine had begun, Richard, if you are reading this without me, and I had only been able to read it once the night I came home from the hospital, sitting at the kitchen table at 2 in the morning, with my coat still on. I had kept it in that drawer, because it was the closest thing I had to her voice. My hand gripped the edge of the nightstand so hard the wood pressed white lines into my palm. My knees felt wrong suddenly, like the joints had been replaced with something unreliable, and I put my other hand on the wall to steady myself. The pressure behind my eyes came fast and total, and I stood there pressing it back with everything I had, breathing carefully, one breath at a time, the way you breathe when the alternative is coming apart completely. I heard footsteps on the stairs and straightened up and turned around. Gloria appeared in the doorway, her expression registering my presence in her bedroom. My bedroom with something between mild surprise and mild irritation. The look of a person who has been interrupted in a space they have come to think of as theirs. "Richard," she said. "Did you need something?" My voice, when it came out, was quieter than I intended, and steadier than I had any right to expect. "There were letters in this drawer," I said. "Personal letters. They belonged to my wife." Gloria tilted her head slightly, as though recalibrating. "I cleared some things out when I set up the room," she said. "I didn't think you were still using this space." "Where are they?" She opened her mouth and then closed it again. And something moved behind her eyes that she did not let reach her face. "I may have put them with some other things," she said. "I'll have a look." "You'll have a look," I repeated. "Richard." Her voice took on the particular patient quality she used when she wanted to sound reasonable. "I understand these things are sentimental, but the room needed— those letters," I said, and my voice came out with an edge in it that surprised even me. A hard, bright line running through every word were the last thing my wife wrote before she died. And they were in a drawer in my bedroom in my house. And I want them back. Gloria looked at me for a long moment, her pale eyes doing their appraiser's calculation. Then she said, "I'll find them," and stepped back to let me pass. I went downstairs and out the back door and stood in the yard in the March cold, with my hand pressed flat against the old oak at the corner of the fence, feeling the bark rough under my palm, breathing the way you breathe when the ground underneath you has just revealed itself to be less solid than you ever imagined it could be. Thomas had asked me what we were going to do. I was beginning to understand exactly what that was going to require. Walter called on a Tuesday morning at 6:58. I know the exact time because I was looking at the clock on the workbench wall when the phone rang, the same clock I had checked every morning since Margaret's watch disappeared from the nightstand drawer 3 weeks before, a loss I had not yet told anyone about, because I did not yet know where it had gone. The one I checked the way other men check their phones, out of habit, out of the need to have something familiar to hold on to. 6:58. 2 minutes before Walter usually started his morning walk. "But don't go anywhere," he said when I picked up. "I'm coming over." His voice had something in it I had not heard before. Not alarm. Something quieter and more careful than alarm, the voice of a man who has decided exactly how he is going to say something difficult before he says it. He was at my back gate in 6 minutes. I met him in the yard, and he looked at me for a moment, with his hands in his jacket pockets, and then he said, "I need you to come with me, down to McLean Avenue. There's something you need to see." We walked. It was a cold morning for early March, the kind of cold that sits in the air long after it should have moved, on the last grip of winter, refusing to let go, and reminding you that spring in New York is a negotiation, not a promise. Walter set a pace that was slightly slower than his usual stride, and I understood without being told that he was giving me time before whatever came next. McLean Avenue was already moving by the time we got there. The deli on the corner putting out its sidewalk sign. A delivery truck blocking one lane while the driver hauled boxes through a propped open door. Walter stopped in front of a pawn shop 3 doors down from the deli. The kind of place with a security grate that folded back from the window during business hours and a hand-lettered sign listing what they bought and sold. He stopped walking and stood beside me and pointed at the display case in the window without saying anything. I looked. In the lower left corner of the display case, on a piece of dark velvet between a man's signet ring and a silver bracelet, sat a watch. Gold-faced, brown leather strap. The leather worn smooth at the place where a clasp had rested for decades. The face slightly scratched at the 2 o'clock position from the time Margaret had caught it on the edge of the car door in 2014 and been so upset about it that I had offered to take it to a jeweler, and she had said absolutely not. She liked the scratch. It was part of the story now. The world narrowed to that watch in the window. I was aware of Walter beside me. I was aware of the traffic on McLean Avenue, and the smell of the deli's coffee drifting through the cold air, and a woman walking past us with a stroller. I was aware of all of it at a great distance, the way you are aware of things when your entire attention has collapsed to a single point. I pushed open the door of the pawn shop. The man behind the counter was heavy-set, middle-aged, with the particular patience of someone who had heard every kind of story that walks through a pawnshop door. He looked up when I came in. "The watch in the lower left of the window," I said. Gold-face, brown strap. He reached in without comment and set it on the counter in front of me. I picked it up with both hands. It was lighter than I remembered. Or maybe I was just holding it more carefully than I ever had when it was simply Margaret's watch on Margaret's wrist, and I had not yet learned what it would mean to see it separated from her. The scratch was there, just above the 2, exactly where it had always been. My chest hurt in a way that was not metaphorical. A real physical ache, deep and spreading, the kind that makes you conscious of your own heartbeat, because it seems suddenly uncertain. "The pawn ticket on this one," I said. "Can you tell me the name?" The man pulled up his records and turned the screen slightly so I could read it. "Gloria Miller. 3 weeks ago. $120. $120. Walter put his hand on my shoulder and kept it there. I stood at that counter for a long moment. I thought about Margaret putting this watch on every morning for 30 years. The particular practiced motion of her wrist as she fastened the clasp. I thought about the last time I had seen it on her in the hospital the day before. She could no longer lift her arm. I thought about the scratch at the 2 o'clock position and her voice saying, "I like it, it's part of the story now." Then I took my wallet out of my jacket pocket and laid $120 on the counter in bills, because I was not going to let that watch sit in a display case for 1 more hour. The man counted the bills, made a note in his records, and slid the watch across the counter. I put it in the breast pocket of my jacket, right over my heart. Then I walked out. On the sidewalk, Walter fell into step beside me. A full block passed before either of us spoke. "There were other things," Walter said quietly. "I checked the place on South Broadway yesterday after I spotted this one. 2 silver chains and a ring. Greenstone silver setting. They'd already been sold. Margaret's ring. The one I had given her on our 10th anniversary, because we had not been able to afford much of anything on our first. I stopped walking. Not because my legs gave out, though they wanted to. I stopped because I needed a moment to make a decision, and I needed to be standing still to make it. "Walt," I said. "Yeah. I'm done waiting." He nodded once, slowly. "I know," he said. "I'll help you do whatever comes next." I started walking again. The watch pressed against my chest, through the fabric of my jacket, gold-faced and steady keeping time. 30 years of Margaret's mornings. $120 on a pawnshop counter. Gloria Miller's name on a receipt. In New York, I knew the law drew a line at $1,000 when it came to theft. Below that line was one charge. Above it was something more serious. I would need Attorney Rourke to look at the total value of what had been taken: the watch, the chains, the ring, and tell me exactly which side of that line we were standing on. But that was a question for tomorrow. Today, I had the watch back, and I had made my decision. Thomas came back the following Saturday. I had not asked him to. He had called Wednesday evening and said he was coming, and the way he said it, not a question, not an offer, just a simple statement of fact, reminded me so much of Gerald that I had to clear my throat before I could answer. We were in the basement workshop again, the two of us, the way it had been the week before. But this time Thomas had his laptop open on the workbench beside the lathe, and he was not there to sand anything. "You said Jason used your computer to print something a few weeks back," he said. "The day his printer was giving him trouble." "Twice," I said. "Maybe 3 times." Thomas nodded and pulled my laptop toward him across the bench. "When you delete a file on a Windows machine," he said, his voice taking on the patient, explanatory quality it got when he was talking about something technical, "the file itself doesn't disappear right away. The system marks the space as available, but the data stays there until something else writes over it. And Windows keeps temporary copies of recently accessed files in a cache folder, a kind of short-term memory the system uses to work faster." He opened a folder on my laptop that I had never seen before, a string of letters and numbers that meant nothing to me. Jason printed something deleted. It thought it was gone. But he didn't know about the cache. I watched him work. His fingers moved across the keyboard with the quick confidence of someone who spent his days inside systems that most people never thought about. He pulled up a recovered file and opened it, and then he sat back and did not say anything, and just let me read. It was a purchase and sale agreement. The property listed was my address on Birchwood Avenue. The seller was listed as Richard Hayes, represented by Jason Miller, acting under power of attorney. The buyer was a man named Derek Souza with a Westchester County address. The agreed purchase price was listed. The projected closing date was 6 weeks from the current date, which meant, counting back from when I was looking at it, now that Jason had created this document, approximately 3 weeks after he and Emily had moved into my house. My hand came down flat on the workbench with a sound that startled us both. 6 weeks. He had a buyer. He had a price. He had a closing date. The only thing standing between Jason Miller and the sale of my house was my signature on a power of attorney that he was planning to present to me as something routine: insurance paperwork, estate planning forms, something a 60-year-old widower might sign without reading carefully enough. "Who is Derek Souza?" I said. "Real estate investor, looks like," Thomas said. "Licensed broker out of Westchester. Whether he knows what Jason is actually doing, I don't know. He might be a legitimate buyer who thinks he's dealing with someone who has proper authority to sell. Or he might know exactly what this is." He paused. "Either way, the scheme to defraud is on Jason's end. In New York, under Penal Law Section 190.65, deliberately planning to deprive someone of property through deception is a felony regardless of whether the final transaction actually goes through. The attempt itself is criminal." I stood at the workbench and looked at the document on the screen and felt a cold, clear fury move through me that was nothing like the hot, disoriented anger from earlier in this ordeal. This was something different. This was the feeling of a man who has been patient and careful and is now in full possession of the facts, and the facts have removed every remaining reason for patience. 6 weeks, I said. From when he made the document, Thomas said, which means you have less than 3 weeks now. I picked up my phone and called Walter. He answered on the second ring. Walt, I said. It's time. A pause of about 2 seconds. I'll be there in 10 minutes, he said. He arrived in 8. We sat at the picnic table in the backyard, the three of us, Thomas with his laptop, Walter with his coffee, me with Margaret's watch on my wrist, and a clarity in my head that I had not felt in months. I laid out everything: the permit, the house sale, Gloria's property records, the power of attorney, plan, the timeline. Walter listened without moving. Thomas filled in the technical details when I needed him to. When I finished, Walter looked at the table for a moment. Then he looked up at me. What do you need? Everything documented, I said. Every piece of it. And I need an attorney. Dan Rourke, Walter said immediately. He handled my neighbor's landlord dispute 2 years ago. Knows New York property law cold. I'll get you his number today. I nodded. Then I looked at Thomas. He was watching me with Gerald's eyes steady and dark, waiting. I need you to send me copies of everything you found, I said. And Tom, not a word to Emily yet. He nodded, but something in his expression shifted when I said Emily's name. A tightening around his jaw that told me he was carrying something about that particular piece of this that he had not yet put into words. She doesn't know any of this, he said. It was not quite a question. No, I said. She doesn't. Thomas looked out at the yard, at the old oak in the corner, at the storage room door at the back of the house where the kitchen light was on, and Gloria's shape moved past the window. He looked at all of it for a long moment, and then he pressed his lips together and nodded again. That night, I sat at the kitchen table after everyone else had gone to bed and ate a bowl of soup I had made myself, and looked at the walls of my kitchen and felt something I had not felt in months. Not peace exactly, not yet, but the specific steadiness that comes when you have been lost in a dark building and you have finally found all the exits. I knew where every door was now, and I knew which one I was going to walk through. The next 10 days, I lived 2 lives at the same time. On the surface, the life that Jason and Gloria could see. Richard Hayes moving carefully through his own house, eating dinner at the table where he was no longer offered the head chair, asking politely about Jason's job search, complimenting Gloria on a casserole she had made with groceries I had paid for, saying good morning, saying good night, giving nothing away. Underneath that, the other life. Walter got me Daniel Rourke's number on a Sunday. I called Monday morning from my truck, parked 2 blocks from the house, engine running for the heat. Rourke's assistant put me through inside of 4 minutes, which told me Walter had already made a call on my behalf. Daniel Rourke had the voice of a man who had sat across from a lot of difficult situations and found most of them manageable. Measured, unhurried, with a directness that reminded me of the best contractors I had worked with over the years, people who told you what the job actually was before they told you what it was going to cost. I told him everything. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he was quiet for about 4 seconds, and then he said, "Mr. Hayes, can you come in Thursday?" I was in his office on Lafayette Street by 9 that morning. He was a compact man in his early 50s, silver at the temples, with a desk that held the organized density of someone who worked on many things simultaneously and never lost track of any of them. He went through everything I brought him: Claire's property records, Thomas's printed screenshots of the message thread, the recovered purchase agreement, the pawn shop receipt, the permit application from the Department of Buildings, page by page, without rushing, making occasional notes in the margin of a yellow legal pad. When he finished, he set his pen down and looked at me. "The clean version first," he said. Your position is strong. You have sole title, no lease, no rent ever paid, no written agreement of any kind, granting anyone rights to this property. The people in your house are what New York law calls tenants at will. They're there with your permission, and they have no independent legal claim to stay. And the less clean version, I said. You cannot remove them yourself, he said. No changing the locks, no moving their belongings to the curb, no shutting off utilities. Any of those actions, and you become the person breaking the law. In New York, a tenant at will, even one paying nothing, even one who walked in under false pretenses, is entitled to 30 days written notice before you can initiate legal proceedings. He pulled a form from his desk drawer. I prepare the notice, you serve it. They have 30 days to leave voluntarily. If they don't, we file a holdover petition at Yonkers City Court, go before a judge and obtain a warrant of eviction. The whole process, if it runs smoothly, is 8 to 10 weeks. 8 to 10 weeks. I thought about the purchase agreement with its closing date now less than 2 weeks away. There's a buyer, I said. A closing date, Rourke nodded slowly. Which is why we're also going to the police. What Gloria did with your wife's property, the watch, the jewelry, that's a theft report, and it gives us a separate criminal avenue that doesn't wait on the civil timeline. He picked up his pen again. The permit application Jason filed is a matter for the district attorney's office. Claire Morgan has the documentation, and I know the right person to send it to. He looked at me steadily. The purchase agreement with Derek Souza Jason had no authority to negotiate a sale, no valid power of attorney, no deed interest of any kind. Whatever he told Souza, the contract is worthless. But it's also evidence of the scheme which under Penal Law Section 190.65 is a felony regardless of completion. I sat in that chair and felt something I had not felt since January. The particular solidity of a man who has found the right tool for the job in front of him. One more thing, Rourke said. He leaned forward slightly. Mr. Hayes, you cannot tell them any of this is coming. Not your daughter, not any of them. The moment they know things start moving out of your house, evidence disappears, stories get coordinated. Right now, they believe they are 3 weeks from a closing date, and you don't know anything. That is an advantage you cannot afford to give back. I thought about Emily, about her face across the dinner table, the way she sometimes looked at me with something that might have been guilt if she had known what she was guilty of. About the fact that she did not know. That she had been handed the same false story as everyone else, and had simply believed it, because she was the kind of person who believed what the people she loved told her. My daughter, I said. She's not part of this. Rourke was quiet for a moment. I believe you, he said. But right now I need you to act as if everyone in that house is part of it, because you don't know where the line is yet. When this is over, you can sort that out. Right now, not a word. I drove home and parked in the driveway and sat for a moment with my hands on the wheel. Then I took the folder I had built, Claire's documents, Thomas's printouts, the pawn shop receipt, everything, and locked it in the metal box I kept in the wheel well of the trunk under the spare tire. Nobody opened other people's trunk wells. It was the safest place I had. That evening I set the table for dinner, poured water for 4 glasses, and asked Gloria how her day had been. She told me at some length. I listened and nodded and gave nothing away. Above the kitchen table, the clock on the wall kept moving. Jason thought he had 3 weeks. I had already started counting differently. Emily told me about it 4 days later. Sitting at the kitchen table at 7 in the evening, with both hands around a cup of tea she had not touched since she poured it. She had come home from her night shift at St. Joseph's at 6 in the morning. She said. She was still in her scrubs, her bag still on her shoulder, her coat still on the way. You come home. When you have been awake for 12 hours, and the only thing between you and the bed is a flight of stairs. She had been reaching for the banister when she heard a sound from the room that used to be my office. A mechanical sound, repetitive, the particular rhythm of a photocopier, making multiple passes over the same document. She had stopped with her hand on the banister. She had stood there for a moment, she said, telling herself it was nothing, that Jason was printing something for a job application, that there was a reasonable explanation, the way she had been telling herself reasonable explanations for things in this house for 4 months. Then she had pushed the door open. Jason was at the small folding table he had set up in the corner of the room, his back to her, working with a pair of scissors and what looked like a sheet of paper and a document she could not immediately identify. He was cutting carefully, she said, the way you cut, when precision matters, along a line that she could tell from where she stood was at the very bottom of whatever he was holding. She took a step into the room. On the table in front of him, she could see a second document, a longer form, multiple pages, with a title across the top in bold lettering that she could read from 3 feet away. Durable Power of Attorney, Property, and Financial Management. Below the title, in the designated signature line at the bottom of the final page, there was a name already printed. Richard Hayes. Jason had not heard her come in. He was focused entirely on what he was doing, cutting the bottom strip from whatever document he was holding. The strip that bore a signature with the careful attention of a man who needed that signature in a specific size to fit a specific space. Emily said her body understood before her mind did. Her stomach dropped the way it drops in an elevator that moves too fast. A sudden vertiginous lurch that had nothing to do with the 12 hours she had been awake. She stepped back out of the doorway without making a sound, pulled the door closed to exactly the position it had been in, and sat down on the floor of the hallway with her back against the wall and her knees drawn up and her heart hammering so hard she could feel it in her ears. She sat there for a long time, she told me. Long enough for Jason to finish whatever he was doing and come out of the room and go upstairs without noticing her there in the hallway. Long enough to replay every conversation she could remember from the past 4 months. Every explanation, every reassurance, every time someone in this house had told her that her father just needed time to adjust. That the house was too big for one person, that families shared space, and that was what families did. She called Thomas that afternoon while Jason was out. She told me Thomas picked up before the second ring, as though he had been waiting for exactly that call. Thomas had sent her everything. The message thread. The purchase agreement with Derek Souza and the closing date that was now less than 2 weeks away. The permit application at the Department of Buildings with Jason's name where mine should have been. The record from the New York Department of State showing that Jason Miller's real estate broker license had been revoked 2 years earlier for falsifying contracts, something he had told Emily was a misunderstanding, a paperwork error that had never been properly resolved. And one more thing Thomas had found while searching. A civil case filing from 3 years ago in New York County Supreme Court. A couple in their late 60s, a power of attorney, a property transaction that should never have happened. A settlement reached out of court, the terms sealed, the matter officially closed. Emily had read all of it. She told me, sitting in her car in the parking structure at St. Joseph's, where she had driven because she needed to be somewhere that nobody from this house could walk through. She had read it, and then she had sat with her hands in her lap and stared at the concrete wall of the parking structure and let the full weight of 4 months settle onto her all at once. When she finally looked up, she told me the first thing she felt was not anger at Jason. The first thing she felt was the specific, nauseating shame of a person who has been the instrument of something terrible without knowing it, who had carried the story, delivered it with tears in her voice. Made it credible, made it work, because she had believed every word of it herself. She had called me on Tuesday evening and asked if she could talk. She sat across from me now at my kitchen table, her tea cold in front of her. Her eyes red in a way that told me she had been crying on and off since the parking structure and had run out of tears sometime in the afternoon. She looked smaller than usual, my daughter, the way people look when something large has knocked the certainty out of them. "Dad," she said. Her voice broke on the single syllable, and she pressed her lips together hard and breathed through her nose and started again. "Dad, I didn't know. I need you to know that I didn't know." My throat tightened so sharply that for a moment I could not speak at all. I reached across the table and put my hand over hers, and her fingers gripped mine with the sudden fierce strength of someone who has been trying to hold something together alone for too long. "I know you didn't," I said. "I know." She pressed her free hand over her eyes, and her shoulders shook once hard. A single sob she caught before it became two. Then she straightened and looked at me with eyes that were wet and steady at the same time, the look I had seen on her face since she was small, when she was determined not to let something beat her. "Tell me what you need me to do," she said. I looked at my daughter across the table, the daughter I had been protecting by keeping her outside of this, who had found her own way to the truth without anyone leading her there, and felt something ease in my chest that had been tight for months. "Saturday night," I said. "Emily, can you host a family dinner on Saturday night?" She looked at me for a moment, reading my face the way she had always been able to read it, the way her mother used to read it. "Yes," she said. "I can do that." Emily set the table the way Margaret used to set it for Sunday dinners. The good plates, the cloth napkins, the candles in the center that we only brought out when something was worth marking. I watched her from the kitchen doorway while she worked and felt a complicated kind of grief that had nothing to do with sadness and everything to do with time, with the years I had spent at this table and what those years had cost and what they had given me in return. Jason came downstairs at 6:30 in the good blazer he saved. For occasions he considered important. His hair combed his expression, carrying the particular satisfied ease of a man who believes the hard part is almost over. He clapped me on the shoulder at the foot of the stairs and said, "Smells great in here, Richard," with the warmth of someone who had decided, apparently, that we were on good terms. "Emily cooked," I said. Gloria arrived last, settling into what had become her customary chair with the deliberate comfort of a woman who had made herself at home in stages so gradual that the transition had seemed to everyone watching like something that had simply happened on its own. We ate. Emily had made pot roast, a long, slow dish that required hours of preparation, which told me she had been in this kitchen since early afternoon, holding herself together with both hands while she put a meal on the table for people who did not deserve it. She was composed in a way that must have cost her considerably. Her hands were steady when she passed the bread. Her voice was even when she answered Jason's questions about her week at work. I ate and said little and watched. Midway through the meal, Jason set down his fork and looked at me with the expression he had been building toward all evening, open, reasonable, carefully warm. "Richard," he said, "Emily and I have been talking, and we think it might be worth having a real conversation about the long term. About the house." Gloria looked up from her plate with the attentiveness of someone who had been waiting for this particular cue. You've been so generous," Jason continued. "But realistically, this space, 4 bedrooms, a yard, all this square footage, it's a lot for one person. We've been thinking that it might make more sense for everyone if we worked out a more permanent arrangement." He smiled the smile he had walked in with, easy and prepared. "Something that works for the whole family." I looked at him across the table. I looked at Gloria beside him, nodding with the slow approval of a woman who had rehearsed this scene in her head many times. I looked at the candles Emily had lit in the center of the table, the same candlesticks Margaret had bought at a shop in Cold Spring the summer before she got sick. Then I reached under my chair and lifted the box onto the table. It was a standard document box, the kind you buy at any office supply store, dark gray with a lid. I set it in the center of the table between the candles and placed both hands flat on top of it, and did not say anything for a moment. Jason's smile held, but something shifted behind it, the way a light flickers before it goes out. "What's that?" he said. I opened the box. I took out the first document and set it on the table and named it. "Property records from Bronx County Clerk's Office," I said, "showing the sale of Gloria Miller's house in June of last year. 8 months before she told me it was tied up in a title dispute." Gloria's fork stopped moving. I took out the second document. "Permit application filed with the New York City Department of Buildings," I said, "listing Jason Miller as owner of record of this property, signed with a name that is not his, and an authority he does not have." Jason's jaw tightened. The easy warmth drained out of his face the way color drains out of something when the light changes. I took out the third document. The printed screenshots of the message thread between Jason and Gloria, 6 weeks of planning laid out in their own words. I set it on the table without comment. I took out the fourth. The purchase and sale agreement with Derek Souza's name and a closing date that was now 9 days away. I took out the fifth. The pawn shop receipt from McLean Avenue. Gloria Miller. $120. The date 3 weeks before Walter had walked past that window on his morning walk. And then I reached into my jacket's breast pocket and set the last thing on the table. Margaret's watch. The scratch at the 2 o'clock position caught the candlelight and held it. Part of the story, she had said. She was right about that. Gloria looked at the watch. The color left her face in a single sudden movement, as though something had pulled it from below. Her hand came up to her mouth, and she pressed it there, and her pale gray eyes filled with something that might have been the first genuine feeling I had seen in them since she arrived. Jason pushed his chair back. "Richard, listen. I'm not finished," I said. My voice came out even and clear in a way that surprised me. Not loud, not shaking. The voice of a man who has done the work and knows what the work has produced, and does not need volume to make himself understood. "I opened this door," I said, because Emily called me on a January night, and I heard my daughter crying, and I could not think of a single reason to say no. I gave you the guest room and the bathroom and a place at my table. I gave Gloria the back bedroom and the run of my kitchen. I moved my own belongings to a storage room. I watched photographs of my wife get packed into boxes because someone needed the shelf space. My voice stayed level. My hands stayed still. I did all of that because I believed I was helping family get through a hard time. That is what I believed. I looked at Jason. You knew before you moved your first box through my door exactly what you were going to do. You had a buyer. You had a closing date. You had a plan to sign my name to papers that would give you the right to sell this house out from under me while I was sleeping in the storage room. I looked at Gloria. And you told a story about a house dispute that ended 8 months before you ever said the words out loud. The room held the particular silence of people who have run out of things to say and know it. Then the front door opened. Emily came through the hallway and into the dining room with her coat still on and a blue folder pressed against her chest. Her eyes going straight to me and not to Jason, not to Gloria, not to the box on the table. She crossed the room and set the folder down beside the box and pulled out the chair next to mine and sat down. Jason stared at his wife. Don't, she said. Her voice was not loud either, but it had something in it I had not heard from her in months, a steadiness that did not come from composure, but from having already decided. I was in the parking garage at St. Joseph's for 2 hours on Tuesday, reading everything Thomas sent me. And then I went home and I printed it. She put her hand flat on the blue folder. Your license was revoked for falsifying contracts, Jason. There's a civil case in New York County. A couple in their late 60s. A power of attorney. She looked at her husband with eyes that were dry and very clear. Did you think I wouldn't find out? Or did you think it didn't matter because I'd already done the part you needed me for? Jason's mouth opened. Nothing came out. For the first time since January, Jason Miller had no prepared answer. Gloria stood up abruptly, her chair scraping back across the hardwood floor, and said something about needing her phone, and the brittleness in her voice told me the phone had nothing to do with it. Then there was a knock at the front door. 3 measured knocks, the unhurried kind. I looked at Jason. That would be Yonkers Police Department, I said. I filed a report for theft of property 11 days ago. They've been working through their schedule. Jason's face went the color of the tablecloth. I stood up and went to answer my own front door. The deputy was a woman in her mid-40s with a Yonkers PD badge and a clipboard, and the particular unhurried professionalism of someone who had been to a lot of houses on a lot of evenings and found most of them more complicated than anyone had intended. I opened the door and told her my name, and she said she was following up on the theft report I had filed 11 days ago and asked if this was a good time. I told her it was. I brought her into the living room, and she stood in the doorway, taking in the room, the displaced furniture, the unfamiliar decor, the general evidence of a space that had been systematically taken over with eyes that missed nothing, but commented on nothing. Jason came out of the dining room first. He saw the badge and stopped walking. Something happened to his face in that moment that I will not forget. Not fear exactly. More like the expression of a man who has been running a calculation in his head for months and has just arrived at the answer and found it is not the one he planned for. His jaw moved once without producing words. His hand went to the doorframe. Gloria came out behind him, her coat already over her arm, her purse already on her shoulder, which told me she had made her calculation faster than Jason had, and had already decided what it meant. She looked at the deputy, then at me, then at the folder and the box still on the dining table visible through the open doorway. She said, "Jason," just his name, but the way she said it carried everything. Jason looked at his mother, then he looked at me. "Richard, you should talk to an attorney," I said. "That's the only thing I have to say to you." He stood there for a long moment, his hand still on the doorframe, the calculation still running behind his eyes. Then he nodded once, a short, tight movement, and went upstairs. I could hear him moving around up their drawers, the closet, a bag being pulled from somewhere. Gloria waited in the hallway without speaking, her posture rigid, her eyes on the floor. The deputy spoke quietly with me while we waited, taking notes, asking questions about the items listed in the report, the dates, the pawn shop on McLean Avenue, and the one on South Broadway. I answered everything. She wrote it down. 20 minutes later, Jason came downstairs with 2 bags. He stopped at the bottom of the stairs and looked at Emily, who was standing in the kitchen doorway, with her arms crossed and her eyes dry, and her chin up in a way that reminded me so much of Margaret that my chest ached with it. "Em," he said. Emily looked at her husband for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice was very quiet and very clear. "I told my father I didn't know," she said. "That was true, but I should have looked sooner. And I'm sorry, Dad, that I didn't." She was not talking to Jason anymore. Jason picked up his bags. Gloria opened the front door. They walked out onto the porch of my house, and down the front steps and across the walkway I had poured with my own hands 20 years ago. And I watched them from the doorway until they reached the car. Jason put the bags in the trunk. He did not look back. I closed the door. The deputy finished her notes, gave me a case number, told me what the follow-up process would look like, and left. And then the house was quiet. In a way, it had not been quiet since January, not the held-breath quiet of a house full of people pretending, but the real quiet, the kind that belongs to a place that is simply itself again. Emily was still in the kitchen doorway. She had not moved. I went to the cabinet and took down 2 mugs, the same 2 mugs I had been unable to find in my own kitchen 4 months ago now, back where they belonged. And I put the kettle on and stood at the counter with my back to her while the water heated, and neither of us needed to fill the silence with anything because the silence was not empty. When the kettle clicked off, I poured 2 cups and carried them to the table and set one in front of Emily and sat down across from her. She wrapped both hands around her mug. Her eyes were wet at the corners. Finally, the tears arriving late, the way they sometimes do when a person has been holding on through the part that required holding on and can only let go once it is over. "Dad," she said. "I know, Town," I said. She pressed her lips together and nodded and looked down at the table. I looked at the 2 mugs between us, ordinary mugs, kitchen mugs, the ones I had used every morning for 15 years, and felt something release in my chest that had been locked there since January, something that went out of me slowly and completely, like a breath I had been holding for months. Outside on Birchwood Avenue, a car started and pulled away. The sound faded down the block and turned a corner and was gone. Attorney Rourke served the 30-day written notice the morning after the dinner by certified mail to all parties as required under New York real property law. It was a formality by then. Jason and Gloria did not come back. What came instead over the following weeks were other things. A call from the district attorney's office about the permit application. A separate call about the purchase agreement with Derek Souza, who turned out to be, as Thomas had suspected, a legitimate buyer who had been told he was dealing with a properly authorized seller and was himself furious when he learned otherwise. The investigation moved at the pace investigations move, not fast, not slow, simply forward the way the law moves when the paperwork is in order and the evidence is what it is. Gloria's situation was referred to the Yonkers DA for the theft of Margaret's property. Attorney Rourke had a jeweler assess the total value of what had been taken. The number came in above the threshold. Grand larceny in the 4th degree. The wheels turned. I did not follow every development closely. I had other things to do. The first Saturday in June, I carried everything out of the storage room. The lawn equipment went back to the garage. The holiday bins went to the basement. Margaret's boxes of clothing, the ones I had never been able to open, I carried upstairs to the bedroom and set on the chair in the corner. And I sat on the edge of the bed for a while and looked at them and decided I was not ready yet, and that not being ready was all right. Then I went to work on the storage room. I painted the walls a clean off-white that let the light in better. I put in proper electrical, a job I could have done in my sleep, and nearly did. It felt so familiar. I built 2 long shelves along the back wall from the walnut board I had never finished, the one that had been sitting on my workbench since January. I brought my tools in from the garage and hung them in their proper order. I set my drafting table against the window that faced the yard. It took 3 weekends. Walter helped with the shelving on the second Saturday, the 2 of us working the way we had worked together for 25 years, measuring twice, not talking unless we needed to. At some point in the afternoon, he looked around at what we had built and said, "Not bad for a storage room." "Not bad at all," I said. Emily came on Sundays. Not every Sunday, not yet. We were still finding the shape of things, still learning what we were to each other after everything that had happened. But she came and she brought groceries sometimes, and we cooked together in the kitchen the way we had not cooked together since she was a teenager. And Margaret was the one telling us both what we were doing wrong. It was careful and small and occasionally almost easy, and I was grateful for every minute of it. Thomas drove down from White Plains on the last Sunday in June, and we spent the afternoon in the new workshop together, the 2 of us building a side table from a piece of cherry wood I had been saving for the right project. He had Gerald's hands. Thomas did the same patience with the grain, the same instinct for where the wood wanted to go. We did not talk much. We did not need to. In July, Walter came over on a Tuesday evening for no particular reason, and we sat on the porch with cold drinks and watched the light go out over the rooftops on Birchwood Avenue, the way it does in summer, slowly and then all at once. And he said, "You doing all right?" "Yeah," I said. "I think I actually am." He nodded, and we sat there a while longer in the particular companionship that does not require anything from either person except to be present. I put Margaret's photographs back on the shelf in the living room, all 12 of them in their mismatched frames she had collected from flea markets over the years. Her wedding watch I still wore on my wrist every morning, the gold face catching the light when I reached for my coffee mug. The scratch at the 2 o'clock position, exactly where it had always been. Some mornings, I took my coffee down to the new workshop and stood at the bench and listened to the house around me. The radiator that knocked twice before it heated up. The stair that clicked. The window on the north side that rattled in a strong wind. All the sounds of a place that was simply itself, that had always been itself, that I had simply needed to remember how to hear. This is my house. I bought it, I built parts of it, I brought Margaret home to it, and raised a daughter in it, and buried my grief inside it. And then one January night, I opened its door without thinking, because my daughter called me crying, and I could not find a reason to say no. I do not regret opening the door. What I know now is who deserves to come through it. The answer is not everyone who asks. The answer is everyone who would do the same for you. And learning the difference at 60 years old in a 4-bedroom colonial on Birchwood Avenue in Yonkers, New York, with a cup of coffee in my hand and my wife's watch on my wrist and the scratch at the 2 o'clock position pointing straight at the morning that is not nothing. That is, in fact, everything. I spent 60 years believing that love meant never saying no. That being the one who always opened the door was the same as being loved. I was wrong. And it took nearly 4 months of sleeping in my own storage room to understand the difference. Do not be like me. Do not wait until a stranger is measuring your walls before you speak up. Say the hard thing early. Put it in writing. The kindest version of yourself is not the one who never refuses it, is the one who protects what matters before it is taken. I believe God gives us these moments not to break us, but to show us what we are finally willing to stand up for. That is the lesson I carry now. Sometimes justice does not look like a courtroom. Sometimes it looks like a 60-year-old man in a workshop he rebuilt with his own hands, wearing his wife's watch, finally breathing easy. That is the quietest kind, and the kind worth keeping. Dignity is not given. It is reclaimed one quiet decision at a time. If you have ever lived a story like this one, you already know that the moment you decide you are done paying for other people's choices is the moment everything begins to change. Family stories like this one belong to everyone who stayed silent too long. The quiet revenge, the kind with paperwork and patience that is the kind worth telling. If this story reached you, share it with someone who needs it. Comment below, I read every word. Subscribe to the channel so you never miss what comes next. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for watching until the very end. A note before you go, some stories on this channel include fictional elements built for reflection and connection. If this style of content is not your preference, we respect that completely. Feel free to find what speaks to you elsewhere.